So for those of you that don't know, my name is Jonathan. I'm a third-year software engineer here at Cal Poly. And just curious, how many people have taken OS? Good, not many of you. Brief intro, what this talk is going to be, a very brief intro into the very, very broad topic of kernel security. Also kind of random. It's a couple topics that I thought were interesting that I just wanted to share with you guys. What this talk is not, this is not a kernel hardening talk. I don't know enough about the kernel to fully advise you how to lock down a Linux kernel, a Windows kernel, or a Mac. It's not an in-depth talk over all of kernel security. Again, I'm no expert in kernel security. This is just things that I've come across that are interesting. So what am I going to be covering? A brief description of what a kernel is, just so we can orient ourselves. Then I'm going to go into a basic understanding of modules, specifically Linux modules, why they can be bad, what they can do. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about Copyonwrite, because an interesting bug that I'm sure all of you have heard of is dirty cow, dirty Copyonwrite. And then just a little bit about what we can do owning Linux boxes or managing Linux servers to try to mitigate the risks of these. So, again, what is a kernel? Coin, clearly. So it's an interface between software and hardware. It's how the code running on your computer can talk to the hardware without needing to know exactly what you're running. It also manages a lot of things like scheduling, IPC or inter-process communication, and memory management. You know, how these apps can share your computer without running and writing on top of each other. Because we don't want one app to be able to read another app. We don't want one app to be able to send whatever it wants over the internet. We want to try to be able to control all of that individually. Some types of kernels. There are a lot of types of kernels that exist out there. Modern kernels tend to be more on the monolithic or hybrid side. What these are kernels where what you would consider the entire operating system is inside of that kernel, and all of that is considered trusted. Hybrid kernels are monolithic kernels, except they are extendable. These are kernels like Linux, Windows, and Mac's XNew. Anyone know how to pronounce that? XNew, thank you. And these kernels provide ways of extending their functionality to support different hardware, support different things like Bluetooth, USB, other things that you don't generally want to fully build into the kernel in case you don't have that hardware. Then there are also things like microkernels and nanokernels and picokernels, which are all smaller forms of kernels. The microkernel is the more common name for these, and the goal is to provide only what's necessary for scheduling, memory management, and inter-process communication, and then hand the rest off to things untrusted, or less trusted at the very least. That way, if your file system driver crashes, you can roll it back up without crashing the whole kernel. So most operating systems that you deal with on a day-to-day basis are run by hybrid kernels. Linux, like I said, Windows, and Mac all use various different kernels that are classified as hybrid kernels. The extensions to these kernels are usually referred to as LKMs, or loadable kernel modules. And these modules go by different names for different operating systems, but they're generally all the same idea. The kernel loads these modules into trusted memory, allows them access to the entirety of what's called kernel space. And I apologize if people don't necessarily know what that is. I realize that's not a given. If anyone has any questions, feel free to stop me and ask, because I might jump past the topic and not come back to it. But all of these are generally compiled files that are loaded into the kernel space when they are needed. So if you're not using a kernel module, it might not load it. But otherwise, once they're loaded in, they function exactly as if they're compiled into the kernel directly, in that they have full access to the space, all of the information in the kernel. So like I was saying, specifically I'll be talking a lot about Linux because it's a more common case, and Mac's a little more tight-lipped about what they do. And I didn't want to dive into whatever the heck Windows does. So like I said, in Linux, they're loaded into kernel space. They have full access to all memory on the device, memory being RAM and hard drives, all of hardware. In most Linux installs, only the root user can load modules. And you are able to blacklist modules that you don't want to load. Like if you're never going to use NTFS, which is Windows file system, you can blacklist the module that loads it in case you're worried about that driver having vulnerability, for example. But I don't have fancy things. I don't have modules, right? Well, no, you probably do. If you're running Linux, a lot of times, much of the functionality of the kernel is actually offset to modules. Things like block devices, USB drivers, Bluetooth devices, your IP config stuff, cryptography. A lot of that is in modules. Say.
What's the difference between just, say, like, blacklisting versus just, like, removing?
So when you blacklist a module, you're telling the operating system, don't load this. You could physically remove the binary, and it would have about the same effect, to my knowledge.
If you wanted something to be, like, a little bit more, I guess, temperate, like, you
could
blacklist it, like, oh, I suddenly have a use for that.
Exactly, like the NTFS example. Yeah, I might not have a use for it right now, but I might have a use for it in the future. Yeah?
Yeah, also to that point, if you delete it and you ever want it in the future, then you have to go and download it.
And probably...
It's better do your signature verification. Exactly, it's better to just tuck it away.
Yeah, yeah.
Do you know what's the difference between like a compiled-in module for Linux and something like, it's called DKMS, Dynamic Kernel MS?
Is that dynamic kernel memory? System? I don't exactly know. If anyone wants to jump in, feel free.
If you build it in, it's already...
Well, so you can compile in modules into the kernel, and I'll talk about that a bit more when I talk about how to try to get around some of this vulnerabilities. But does DKMS just refer to loadable?
So the analogy I have heard
Okay.
for modules versus DKIMs is static versus dynamic movement libraries.
Ah.
Okay. Makes sense.
And if that analogy doesn't make sense, it's an analogy between two very complicated things. It's not really useful.
It's taking two complicated things, very poorly mapping them to two other very complicated things, and then some people went,
Yep. So now let's talk a bit about why modules can be bad. So loadable kernel modules, not referring to DKMS, they are loaded directly into memory, into kernel space memory. That means, like I said, they have access to everything on your computer. That means a vulnerability in that module is just as bad as a vulnerability in the kernel itself, in the kernel binary itself, assuming that you can do the same exploitation with both. And the more modules you have, the more surface area there is for someone to poke at your system if they have any kind of access to it. Oh, you're going to say something? So what can a loadable kernel module do? Say you load one by accident that's malicious. What can it do? So there's a file system, or a pseudo file system rather, in Linux called procfs. Everything in Linux is a file. In order to access some of what's happening in the kernel, it provides these pseudo file systems, like the proc file system and the sys file system, that allow you to read some of the information about what's happening. For instance, what modules you've loaded. However, Well, if you have access to the kernel, you can tell it to not display the modules that are loaded, so you can hide from that. Okay, well, there's also sysfs, like I said. Well, same difference, hide from that. You can pretend that you remove yourself because you have access to the full syscall table. And a common way to do things, yeah, sorry.
So are these exploits, so once you're already in the kernel, you can do this?
Yeah, this is you are a Linux kernel module, or sorry, loadable kernel module that has gotten in.
Got it.
So what can they do if they're there to hide themselves from you? Sorry, be a little more clear. You can mess with any system call, like sysremove module, for example, and just say, yeah, no, I'm gone, I promise. And then just, again, remove yourself from procfs and sysfs. You can intercept syskill calls. So the main way your operating system says, hey, stop that from running, forget it, it does nothing now. And many more. You have access to the whole machine. You can do a lot of things. So, well, I don't have time to read through the entirety of the code base of every single module that I load into my kernel. Most of us don't. So what can I do to try to reduce that attack vector? Well, like we were talking about, you can compile modules into the Linux kernel. Most compile into the kernel like the minimum amount that you need on every machine and then provide modules for the rest. But if you compile your own kernel, you can choose to load all of them in, and there's some nice like GUI ways of doing that if you're scared of the command line. But you still have to trust all that code, right? It's still in the kernel. You just compiled it in so that more things can't be loaded later. So the main thing that you want to try to do is to remove everything that you don't explicitly need. Because, again, a lot of security is just reduce the attack vector to the smallest possible thing we can have. And that is part of the point of microkernels. If you have less things trusted in kernel memory, if you trust as little as physically possible, then there's a smaller window for people to attack. How is it? Okay. Oh, well, it was the next slide. A lot of people, originally these were avoided, however, for performance reasons. The overhead of that inter-process communication is theoretically a lot worse than a microkernel where everything can just reach wherever it wants to. But obviously we're talking about a system where we don't want everything to reach wherever it wants to. So, in that sense, microkernels are good. I don't know any large-scale system that actually has a microkernel, I believe. Yeah?
Have you heard of Google's Fuchsia OS?
Sorry, what OS?
Fuchsia OS.
Fuchsia OS? I have not.
Fuchsia,
Is it a microkernel?
yeah,
Okay,
actually,
cool.
So there's this old embedded microkernel called Little Kernel that's often used on embedded devices.
Okay.
And Google actually took that and is reworking it to try to make a more general purpose operating system out of it.
Oh, cool. So there are a couple things being developed in terms of microkernels, but currently there aren't large-scale, Linux does not have a microkernel option, for example. So I am going to step away from modules for a while. If anyone has any questions after all of that, feel free. No? Cool. So what else does the kernel do? Memory management. It handles what gets to write where in your computer. That's both disks and into your RAM. So some basics on memory for I'm scaring Nick. Some basics on memory for people that haven't been exposed to it. Programs are assigned what's called virtual memory space. That means they see a contiguous block of memory that looks to them, like I said, they get a continuous block of memory. However, how that memory is mapped is completely up to the kernel. It could point to disk, it could point to shared pages between programs, and also that memory could be mapped in different ways. Some of it could be read-only, some of it you could actually have read-write access to. And there is an optimization in the Linux kernel, and used in a lot of other places, but again, I'm going to be talking about the Linux kernel, called Copyonwrite. What this does is it allows a program to map some memory to a file that they don't have write access to without making a full copy of it. That way they can avoid the performance hit of making that full copy and then just continue to use it until they need to write to it. And at that point, the kernel copies that memory into its own private sector of RAM, and then the write's made. This allows you to do things like when you fork a process in Linux, all of those pages can just be Copyonwrite until you attempt to change them. That way, the fork command, which just means make two running instances of this program, doesn't take a huge performance hit. And a lot of things won't be changed between those calls. Or another common example, is if you fork and then exec, which just means you split the program and then tell one of those threads to run a different, or one of those processes to run a different program. Rather than copy all of it over and then overwrite it anyway when you do the exec, you just copy it over. You don't make a copy, and you just make a new memory page, new pages in memory. But what happens when you mess that up a little bit? How many people have heard of Dirty Cow? Okay, good number. So Dirty Cow is a kernel vulnerability that's been around for like 10 years, 9 years? Can't remember. I think Linus tried to fix it once, or somebody tried to fix it once, and it was reverted thanks to an Intel commit. So it's a vulnerability in the kernel that if you do a very specific set of things with two threads, namely in one thread you say, hey, I don't need this memory anymore that I requested. And in another thread, you continuously try to write to it, which after you've said, I don't need this memory, if you try to write to it, the kernel will reload that memory. And if you keep doing this between two threads, there was a small erase condition that at one point when the memory you want to write to gets dropped, before the original memory gets marked read-only again, I believe, or some erase condition between being marked unwritable and the other memory being dropped, you could actually write to that mapped section of memory, which would then get propagated to disk. Well, does that really matter? Yeah, a little bit. So if you can read a file, you can now write to it. For example, etc password. Etc password lists out the users of a system and also their password if they have one, and what user ID they are. Root's user ID 0. After the first colon, you have the password, which is blank. So root didn't have a password, right? Not anymore. And you can do this with any file you can read to, read from. You can now write to it. So this is the easiest way, because now you have a no password root account. And at which point you can load one of those Linux or loadable kernel modules into the system. It hides itself, and you're done. Look at that. So now that we've talked about how bad things can be, let's talk a little bit about what we can do about it. First, update your system. Known vulnerabilities get patched. If you still have a kernel that's vulnerable to Dirty Cow, yeah, that's your own fault. There are ways to scan kernel memory. There's a tool that I'll talk about in a bit called KMem that lets you see kernel memory. And you can look through that and try to see if rootkits exist or if there's any other oddities in kernel memory. You can try to reduce the attack vector. There's a thing called secure compute, or setcomp, which essentially allows you to restrict an application's ability to access the kernel by restricting their system calls. The most strict form of that gives you read, write, and exit, and that's about it. It's a little ridiculous, and it was what they deemed the minimum necessary for a functional app. There's now like ways to set it to give you more system calls, but typically that's used by things like sandboxes to constrain apps. And then you can, why are there two? There's a backslash after kernel. And then, like I said, you can try to compile everything into the kernel. You still have the risk of a bad kernel modules. However, you can disable loading of new modules. So at the very least, if anyone gets root on your computer, they can't load a kernel module that hides itself. The trick with that, though, is if someone gets root on your computer, they have access to the kernel binary itself. So what are you actually doing? Nothing. Don't reboot. Yeah, I mean, and then there's also what's called MAC, or mandatory access control. And that's just another system to try to restrict what applications can do to your system. And we'll talk about that. So kernel scanning. Like I said, KMEM is a tool, Linux application that lets you look into the kernel memory space. Obviously, you have to run it as root. Fun. But other tools can use that to attempt to scan through kernel memory and see if anything's weird. For example, they might look through the syscall table, which is what a lot of rogue kernel modules mess with first, to try to make it so they can't be killed or they can't be removed. Scan through that and see if any of those pointers reference outside of the static kernel space, or the original kernel, because they really shouldn't. You know, a kernel module should never say, hey, syskill, go to me. I promise, I'm not doing anything weird. You can also check for the pseudo file systems to see if they've been tampered with, like procfs or sysfs. And there are tools that exist to do this for you. Obviously, you're not going to take a binary dump of your kernel and start reading through it. I think I saw like Jekyll or something. There are some weird tools for it, but so before I talk about Mac, there's also this thing called DAC, which is Unix permissions, basically, just where they kind of went, what was before Mac. But it's things like file permissions, and that just helps to reduce who can access what, and that's in every Unix-like operating system. But Mac is mandatory access control. Sorry, I'm saying Mac. It's not like OS X. What you can do with a Mac system is disallow things like access to paths in the system or specific inodes of the system, which are Linux's unique, or Unix-like operating system's unique identifier for block objects or files. On top of that, ways of implementing these mandatory access systems are what are known as LSM, or Linux security modules. Those modules are allowed to get callbacks to things like exec and other important system calls that are generally used on exploiting, but not every system call. So even this isn't foolproof, but it does allow you to try to catch some things. And examples of Mac systems that use LSM are AppArmor and SE Linux, which if any of you have used Ubuntu, it comes with AppArmor. I believe AppArmor is a Debian-based thing. And SE Linux, I think, was a government attempt to create a way of controlling access to confidential information. Red Hat does use it. I believe it was developed by NSA? Yeah, NSA. Yeah, I was about to say, so trust what you want.
SE stands for security enhanced.
Yeah, security enhanced Linux. Yeah.
So how do you disallow access to these paths if you're flooding against somebody?
So calls like open can be hooked by these Linux security modules. And the usual flow is, it checks DAC, which it says, do you have permission to access it by your user, by your group. And then there's actually a callback to these LSMs that says, hey, this person is trying to access this path or this inode. Can they? And at that point, you can deny them.
So these aren't like best against like a bad kernel launcher?
No. LSM is a bit different. Sorry. But you can do things like block calls to, it's like kernel load module. I can't remember the exact sys call, but that one, you can block that to try to stop people from loading modules. Yeah. And that's about it. If anyone has any other questions, like I said, it was a bit of a scatterbrained, kind of everywhere talk, but if anyone, yeah.
So if someone does get a kernel module on me, is that just it for my system? Is there anything I can do?
No, so that was the scanning part.
Okay.
If someone does get, a rogue kernel module on your system, it can hide, looking through procfs, looking through sysfs, it really depends on how hard they try to hide. If they do a bad job of hiding, well, you can see, rootkit.ko somewhere. That's probably a bad thing. Sounds like a bad thing. It depends on how well they hide. There are tools that can read through kernel memory and try to tell you fairly accurately whether there's a kind of odd thing where a loaded kernel module will reference into that syscall table. But at that point, you're trusting a third-party application to have full read access. I guess it's only read access, but kernel read access. So kind of a toss-up there. Any other questions? Yeah, sorry.
So Nick emailed me a kernel module, and I loaded it.
That's fun.
So this happens, and then he did all sorts of very bad things. And I have no idea what he did. What do I do to have a usable computer now? Because I got to log into my bank.
Yeah.
You can pay.
Burn it. I mean, realistically, once something has access to kernel space, it's really hard to guarantee you'll have a clean system afterwards. You can block loading of all modules, but it might have modified the binary. You can try to scan the binary to see if anything is weird there, but depending on how well it hides, it might not be found. Watching network traffic is tricky because your kernel usually tells you what network traffic you're using, so it's kind of hard to hide
The
that.
answer is nuke and pave your hardware.
More or less, it's kind of hard to fully clean up and trust that it's gone. Go for it though if you have.
What can we do with my hardware that isn't just the disk?
I mean,
it could install any, if there are any hardware exploits that it knows about, it could definitely install them on your system.
but it has full access to your system it has the highest level of access to your system. So if something is exploitable, it can do it at that point. Don't do that, basically.
So in Nick's case, it's not even safe for him to wipe the operating system. Like the computer might still be exploited.
I mean, yes, but
Sorry, Nick. You're not a dick like that.
at some point, it's your threat model. Do you think someone's went through the effort of finding hardware vulnerabilities that are specific enough to you, or enough of them that one applies to you? It happened to be loaded in this kernel module. Odds are no, but I mean, I don't know what you're hiding, so.
Could be one hell of a phishing.
That'd be one hell of a phishing attack, just for a bank password. And a lot of these, if you're going through this amount of effort to hide, you're probably not looking for just a bank password. You're probably looking for something really secret.
Probably
Yeah. I mean, well,
California.
yeah, probably.
I mean, technically California would be a state-level actor, although I don't think that they're doing anything
Hey, you never know.
super secret without the U.S.
Any more questions? Any other random asides people want to talk about? I don't know. Talk went a little quicker than I thought it would. Yeah?
Do you know anything about the GNU Earth kernel?
I do not know much about it, sorry. Wish I could help you there. Paperware.
It's not done yet. I think that's the one thing I've heard of it.
Yeah.
Design of the operating system.
Yeah.
That's the design of the operating system for security.
Microkernel is definitely on the theoretical side is more secure than a monolithic kernel. The attack vector is way smaller. The only things it has to deal with is, like I said, inter-process communication, scheduling, and memory management, which, if that's all your kernel has to deal with, you can really focus on making that part of your kernel secure. I forget where I read it, but I believe some government entity attempted to shrink the kernel to a point where they could read through and trust all of it. Yeah, I read something about that somewhere. But yeah, the smaller code base you have, the more you can secure it. Yeah. So.
What's the safest operating system?
One in cement.
Turned off computer.
Yeah, turned off computer, buried in a vault. I have Arch Linux, or Arch Linux if you'd prefer.
Put through Apple's one-way physical hash function.
I've heard Linux is pretty secure.
Minix,
Yes,
yeah,
because no one uses it.
Exactly.
you know, I mean, the smaller user base, the smaller, odds are better.
It is the XKCD of Haskell code is guaranteed to never have any bugs because no one will ever run it.
Yeah,
It's very secure. It doesn't do very much, but
yeah, exactly. If you don't want any functionality, I don't need to really read file systems. I don't need to really control CPU. Oh,
No.
no, there's a 3-second window for you to hit spacebar to kick it back up. But yeah, in cement is probably the best answer to secure operating system. Not Windows is also a decent answer. Your choice. It's a little easier to see what's happening in a Linux and a little more controlled in a Mac environment. By Mac, I mean OS X. You do not use Mac when I have mandatory access control up.
Or method authentication code.
Yeah. Did you have another?
Ask why is Windows bad versus?
In my opinion, well, okay. So why is Windows bad, or why do I think it's, no.
Why is Windows
Windows less secure? Well, for starters, the people that make it are spying on you, which is, kind of a bad start. If anyone's...
Kernel closed source?
The Windows NT kernel? I believe so, but I'm not, but if you've heard about the Windows 10 Creators Update, they said, so, anything you type in a search bar, we want to know about it just to see what you're searching for. Any file you open, we want to know the path to it and the file name. Apparently, people have watched network traffic and watched packets go out on keystrokes. I don't know how true the last one is, but I've read through the Windows Creator Update, privacy policy, and it's honestly whatever files you open, path name, search anything, it all gets sent to Microsoft. So that's not a good start.
Yep. All right.
Yeah. And then Linux has a lot of people looking at the source, which yes means people can exploit it, but also means people can say, hey, this is a problem, please fix it. So it's more secure by more people looking at it, if that's a logical argument. Yeah.
Do you think the Windows kernel would be more secure if they didn't render font hidden scroll bars in the kernel itself?
If windowing and stuff was managed not in the kernel, probably, but that's just an attack vector thing. Yeah, there's a lot of code that gets piled into the kernel that shouldn't be in the kernel, and that's in both Linux and Windows. The fact that the windowing system is in the kernel in Windows is not okay. What?
Even for Linux?
No, sorry, I'm saying there's too much code in the kernel in both cases. No, the X windowing system is in user space in Linux, whereas, yeah.
My new favorite one for Windows is that they took the Edge JavaScript engine and put that in the kernel.
Wait, that's in the kernel? JavaScript in kernel space. JavaScript in kernel space.
JavaScript can be in the kernel space. Makes it wonderful.
Was it really?
Yes,
That's
fine.
why NodeOS has 0 users.
Go on. Yeah.
What are some good resources to learn about kernels in general for graduating seniors that don't have an opportunity to take operating systems? Not a specific question.
Take an extra quarter.
Just kidding. If I can graduate.
Yeah, get out of here, Nathan. In general, like general thing, like full understanding of the Linux kernel, or just like
Key concepts, ideas, like more than you get from, like more than syscalls from like, I don't know.
I mean, if you want an understanding of the kernel, write a loadable kernel module. See what things you can get to, what things you can't get to. Do you have a... Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, modern operating systems are like a giant. And with these monolithic kernels, most of the operating system is in the kernel. It's really hard to like just jump into it and understand what's going on. So I would say the operating system textbook would probably be the best place to start. Otherwise, Minix is the smallest place to try to jump in. Because if you try to jump into the Linux kernel, like, good luck. Yeah, and Minix is short, relatively. It's short. Anything else? Cool. Thank you, everybody. Have a good one.